I'm glad to be here today to join with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers as we all across this nation work together believing in the possibilities of America. And I want to greet you from North Carolina, the North Carolina NAACP, the Moral Monday movement down south in North Carolina, where we are fighting a hard fight against a fresh expression of extremism. We're standing together of all different races, colors, creeds, kinds, sexualities, because we believe in the promises of America. And I come from those lands to say we're in a fight, and all over this nation and in our states, we need to be together, because if it has not come your way, it will come. Tonight I want to walk a little bit. Now, I'm not a quick, one of those little twin engine planes. I'm a jumbo jet. So I don't just take off real quick. But also I think that we're in the middle of a time in history, Lynn, and like teachers, you know, you need a lesson plan. You know, when somebody comes in your algebra class, you don't take them all the way to the highest form of algebra first. And I think that we're in a time where we need some thoughtful consideration about where we are. So I'm not a bumper sticker phraseology. I can do that when necessary, but I want to work through a few things tonight with you. And I want to start in my own history. 51 years ago, almost. When I was born, this nation was in a moral crisis. There were governors whose lips were dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. They were defying the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. They were defying the 15th Amendment. They were defying the Brown versus Board of Education decision when I was born. And it wasn't just limited to the South. Governors, even in the North, persons even in the North, were fighting against going forward. And they kept trying to take this nation backwards. They were stuck, along with their immoral allies, in the attitudes of racism and classism, and had no shame. One of them even declared, in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod the earth, I draw the line in the dust and I toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he became popular not just in the South, but he ran a national campaign. George Wallace got votes in the North, almost got elected in some ways. In that moment, those who wanted to move forward were called outside agitators. If you came down to the North, from the North to the South, you were called a troublemaker, stirring up our Southern people, say it in the best way possible. And even in our northern cities, Dr. King says people did not want change even here. Dr. King said he had not faced later on, I think it was around 65, 64, 65, 66 maybe, that he had not seen the kind of racism that he saw, for instance, in the northern city of Chicago, that he had seen down south. During that time, violence accompanied this moral crisis. 51 years ago last month, Medgar was killed. Medgar Evers was killed. In '63, 4 little girls were blown up in a church while they were studying the Sunday school lesson, Love Your Enemies, just because they and their parents wanted to see integrated, non-segregated public schools. And a president who was no raving liberal was killed in part because he was being moved to do the right thing. In this moment, however, the devotees of justice and freedom did not shrink back. They didn't have all the money. They didn't have the political votes, because the Dixiecrats in many ways and some of their other allies had control of the Congress. They didn't have the majority of public opinion, because segregation in many ways was still polling high. But they did not shrink. They marched in our southern lands and in our northern towns, cities. They organized, they built coalitions, they rallied young people, they engaged in civil disobedience. When I was born, 2 days after the March on Washington, my mother said she went into labor on the 28th, but I looked, peeped out and saw some of you all getting ready to march. Some of y'all had to be there with this gray hair in the room. And I said, let me wait a minute and see what's happening. But the March on Washington didn't just happen. It wasn't about kumbaya. It wasn't about people just holding hands. It was a march for jobs and justice. Labor unions and civil rights were together, and people came to that march because there were 200 cities where people were in jail across this country. They rallied young people. They rallied young people. 50 years ago, this month, young people were leaving the North, going into the South. Young people who didn't have the right to vote, because the right to vote for 18-year-olds would come later, in the 1970s, were down South. Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman were killed. And rather than the young people destroying the community, the death made them go deeper, made them get stronger, made them get more determined. They lobbied. They turned moments of despair into a movement of hope. They came together. They lifted up the moral principles and religious principles of justice, love, and fairness. My parents were public educators in Indianapolis, Indiana. My father had 2 master's degrees. My mother had a degree in business and was a consummate musician. In fact, one day when Dr. King came to Indiana, she was the only one in the audience that could play, lift every voice, and sing from the music score from memory, and then add by ear. But in 1963, when I was born, after the March on Washington, they made a decision. They made a decision that they had to lift up one of the faith principles. My father was a preacher. He said, I got to live by Hebrews 10:39. We are not of those who shrink back unto destruction, but we are those who persevere unto the salvation of the soul. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So after the March on Washington, with their new child, they chose to leave the comfort of Indianapolis that had desegregated, that was doing some things, trying to move in the right direction, and they decided to come back to the South, my daddy's homeland, and fight for equality in public education. 11 years after Brown, schools were still not desegregated in North Carolina. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1971, after the Swan case in Charlotte. But my parents' generation didn't quit. My parents said, we're going back. My father gave up what he was doing in the South. And to make that decision, they had to be willing to put their only child in segregated public school. In other words, I would have gone to integrated kindergarten, but my parents, in order to be on the front lines of changing years and years of segregation, they packed up, went back to the South, knowing that it would mean, number one, my daddy wouldn't have, even though he had 2 master's degrees, he wouldn't have protected voting rights because the Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until '65. And 2, that their only son, his namesake, would have to be demeaned by going to segregated kindergarten and 1st and 2nd grade, and he didn't know how many, but in order to be on the front line, they made that decision. And they joined the moral crusade to change the world. And my God, that generation changed the world, didn't it? Oh, they made a difference. They challenged the immoral realities of racism and classism and the sins of injustice, and they changed the world because for them it was not about Democrat and Republican and left versus right and conservative versus liberal. It was about learning what matters in this life and making a decision that you've got to do what is right. They understood that they were not just in a political movement, they were in a moral moment, a moral crisis, and that crisis demanded people that would stand up and do what was right. Now I want to say today that just like they didn't turn back then, we can't turn back now. I believe deep within our being there is a longing for a moral compass. And for those of us who are moved by the cries of our brothers and sisters, we know, like justice, the acts of caring for the vulnerable embracing the stranger, healing the sick, protecting workers, welcoming and being fair to all members of the human family, educating our children, supporting, honoring teachers should never be policies regulated to the margins of our social consciousness. In fact of the matter, these are not just policies. These are issues not just for, as I said, this left-right debate, but these are values that grow out of our deepest faith tradition, our deepest constitutional traditions, and they are all connected if we're going to be a great nation. Martin Luther King said 46 years ago in one of his last sermons, that if you ignore the poor, then one day the whole system will collapse and will implode. The costs are too high. If we don't address systemic racism and poverty, it costs us our soul as a nation. Every time we fail to educate a child on the front side of life, it costs us on the back side. It costs us who we are and who we claim to be. That's why we must challenge those even today who say they want to reform education. Now granted, there is reformation needed, but I'm a wordsmith. And my grandmother that didn't go to college used to say, boy, you not only got to listen at what folks say, you got to check out what they do. Jesus said, there are people who will say, Lord, Lord, with their mouth, but their heart is far from them. Because sometimes the language of reform today is coded language, which actually means we want to dismantle and deform, not reform, public education. So when somebody sits down and says they want to reform public education, the first conversation we have to have with them is real reform will begin with some principles, some unchanging principles. And if you don't want to have this discussion and ensure that these principles are in whatever you're implementing, you're not really interested in reform. Well, at least reforming forward. You're interested in a kind of reform that takes us backwards. One of those principles is public education, public money goes to public education. That's a principle. Not the little voucher schemes. That's a principle in North Carolina that's 146 years old in 1868 when whites and blacks came together to rewrite the Constitution after slavery. In Article 1, they put a clause that every child had a right to a constitutional public education, and that all public tax dollars can only be used for public education. That's a principle. There's a second principle. We're willing to have this conversation about reform, but those of us who come from people like my parents who gave their life to public education, we know the language. So if you want to have a discussion about reform, the second principle, any school built or open must adhere to the law that is 60 years old. 60 years old this year. It's a law. Separate is inherently unequal. That's not an AFT principle. That's not a Barber principle. That's the law of the land. And so, whatever you want to reform and set up, the question is, do you want it to be subject to integration and the civil rights laws of this country? You want to start some charter schools? Do you really want them to be subject to civil rights laws and that principle that's separate? That means segregation or resegregation is inherently unequal. Now folks say, well, I don't believe that. That's not the issue. It's the law of the land. And it's true, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. You got to ask the question, why is it acceptable? For instance, when we have these discussions in North Carolina on charter schools, why is it acceptable to judge public schools on the same metrics we judge charters when they can pick and choose the students they admit? If we're going to have a conversation about reform, let's be honest. Are you willing, when you talk about reform in any format, to ensure that those schools comply with desegregation and do not become just open doors for resegregation? Real reform understands that public education and public schools are where most American students are. And if you want great schools, we know what kind of reform we ought to have. The question is, do we have the will to do it? And it's the principles of that. Here are the principles. You want great public schools. Number one, you have to stop resegregation and promote diversity. You cannot walk around the conversation about resegregation. Not if you're talking about great schools for all. Number two, you have to ensure equity in funding. Number three, you have to have high quality teachers in smaller classrooms and honor those teachers. Number four, you have to have high quality facilities for every student, regardless of what community they're in. Number six, you have to focus on math, science, reading, and history. Number seven, you must promote parental and community involvement. Number eight, you must address the disparities in suspensions, dropout, and graduation rates as it relates to poor children, minority children, and African American children. Those are the principles of reform. The Brookings Institute, which is no liberal institute per se, has said the most segregated areas of our country are the most economically depressed areas. That is no coincidence. We are that principle. Separate is inherently unequal. The Brookings Institute in 2007 study of more than 300 American cities showed that segregation was one of the most important causes of economic decline. You cannot have a serious conversation about reform without dealing with race and without dealing with resegregation. The 20 most economically depressed cities in America are the 20 most segregated cities in America, according to Brookings. And the Brookings Institute went on to say that the two greatest challenges in school performance is high poverty, resegregated public schools. So if you're talking about reform and you're just going to create more high poverty, resegregated public schools in the name of charter, that ain't reform, that's reversal. That's taking us backwards, not taking us forward. Now these are time-tested principles. And any conversation about reform that doesn't want to talk seriously about the issue of race and high poverty is not a real conversation about reform. It amazes me how people demand the same of high poverty students as those who have resources, and then try to say the reason that poor schools are not performing is because if the kids were just more moral, if they would just act better. That has absolutely nothing to do with them having a high quality math teacher or a high quality physics teacher and the right resources. That's what desegregation was really about. It didn't matter. You can be the greatest, most disciplined student in the world, but if you're working with a 20-year-old telescope and I'm working with a modern telescope, I am inherently in a deficit position. And that had nothing to do with being a victim. It had nothing to do with being a victim. Jack Bogle says, who's a lawyer at UNC, says that when we ask kids in high poverty resegregated schools to perform and then we set up something and we have a few anomalies, you know, like we say, well, there's a valedictorian at that high poverty school, so that means that the kids would just work hard. There's a valedictorian at every school. But then you have to look at how when you're out of high poverty, low resource, segregated schools, you have kids coming out who are graduating valedictorian, graduating from honors classes, but because they didn't have certain resources and didn't have certain opportunities, even when they get to college, they're at a deficit in their level of performance. And Jack Boger says he said that's a snooker. We call it a snooker. See, I used to hustle pool. And we know a game when one is at afoot. Jack Boger said to tell children that are in resegregated high poverty schools that it's all right. Don't worry about the resegregation. Don't worry, just act good and you can get it. And just because a few people make it, it's tantamount to somebody playing a pool and they want to do a trick shot stand. So what they do is they tilt the pool table up at the end, right? And then they say, now make the shot. Now somebody, a hustler, can make that shot. But that's not how you play pool. You're supposed to play pool with a level table. Any system that says just give the money or give us control without commitment to diversity, it doesn't matter if it comes from the right or from the left, it's just wrong. Any system or any so-called reform that dismisses resegregation doesn't understand that resegregation is not just about bodies. It's not that black kids can't learn if they're not in the same room with white kids, but there are some things white kids can't learn or black kids can't learn, but it's deeper than that. The resegregation of bodies leads to the resegregation of budgets, which leads to the resegregation of buildings, which leads to the resegregation of books, which leads to the resegregation of the building blocks of the kind of curriculum that empower and the kind of courses that can be offered. We have that same foolishness down in North Carolina, in my city I'm in. We're in a suit with them right now, Goldsboro, North Carolina. 60 years after Brown, it's 100% resegregated, 100% resegregated. And you have some blacks and some whites saying, no, that's all right. No, it's not all right. It's not all right. And then they came around, they wanted me to, I remember the night they came over, wanted to do some charter schools, and I was open, because I'm open to discussion, but I'm gonna probe you. You know, I'm gonna say, well, we wanna create these schools so we can give these kids opportunities. Well, what about resent? Well, we don't wanna talk about that, we just wanna give them opportunities. And then they kept talking, what kind of opportunities? Then they got the charter. And then that's when they called me and said, well, you let your son come? I said, well, why would you want my son to come? He scored 1900 on the SAT. You said, at the beginning, this wasn't what this was for. You said it was to deal with these students, and it was going to help, and we're going to bring black and white poor children together. That's what you said, but you didn't want it in writing because you really weren't telling the truth. That's why you didn't want the riders on the public money that says you can only get it if you're going to do certain things. We've been through that again before. Then there's the attempt to move limited resources around without talking about fully funding public education. And we get trapped in that. We get trapped in that sometimes as advocates, allowing people to say we don't have the money. We have the money, we're just not willing to set up the proper kind of tax system that guarantees the money. So what happens is we allow people to end up putting us in a position where we're fighting over the crumbs. And then we argue, then they want to argue that, you know, per pupil spending and teacher experience expenditure is not the most important thing. The children just need to behave. And then we play this little hocus pocus. We pit this group on reform against this group, all arguing over crumbs when we really should be talking about fully funding public education. That's what we really should be talking about. And then you get corporate folk and Wall Street people, you know, saying, well, you know, we have to, you know, because we got to cut taxes. I'll tell y'all where that came from in a minute. And we got to keep the taxes low, and we don't have the money. You know, Wall Street never says money doesn't matter. You got to be careful of who tells you the money doesn't matter. Just work hard, teacher. You know, just it doesn't matter whether you have benefits and whether you have tenure and whether you have a decent wage. Just give it your all. It doesn't matter if these schools have money. Wall Street, you never hear a bank saying money doesn't matter. You know, ask some people, well, I don't care what side of the aisle they're on, wealthy, when we talk about public education and they want to say, well, you know, we just got to work with what we have. They don't do that. Huh? And they believe in diversity. There's not a banker in here that doesn't believe in diversity. They want a little black money, a little white money, a little green money, a little Latino money, a little Somalian money, a little African money. They want diversity, you know. And it's amazing that you don't ever see them turning folk away from their bank. But then they want, you don't hear nobody talking about no damn neighborhood bank. I want to talk about neighborhood schools and limited access, but nobody talks about neighborhood bank. They say, come over here and put all you can. And those who purport to care about public education shouldn't say it doesn't matter about money, resources. Now there's a history to how we talk about education that has some roots and words that every so often are repackaged, which we got to wrestle with too when we talk about this reform stuff. See, if you trade this week, in 1959 was the first time black students entered Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, August 13, 1959. If you look back through history, the cry to defund and deform public education by those committed to resegregation traces back to that history. Now, it actually had begun earlier than 59. It actually began when the first protests and riots happened in New York after the Brown decision. The first protest against the Brown decision didn't happen in the South. The first protest happened in New York. Freddie Koch, the father of Charles and David Koch, led the John Birch Society and was the nemesis to the NAACP and the civil rights community. He called for the impeachment of Earl Warren. The John Birch Society called for the impeachment of Earl Warren, and they were angry at Eisenhower because Earl Warren led the court in the Brown decision, and they thought that because of his stance against Chinese immigrants when he was in California meant that he would not prosecute in this particular way on the court. After the Brown decision, we forget 1955, the lawyers went back to court and argued that the courts had a right to say that desegregation was wrong, but did not have the authority to push the states in doing it, so they added the clause with all deliberate speed, which is inconsistent because you can't be deliberate and speedy. We got to understand where this and then the cries to defund the Federal Department of Public Education didn't start with Michelle Bachmann. She's just picking it up from the folk that started saying it after the Brown decision. It's a history to this stuff, because if you don't want to follow the court's order to desegregation, then you start defunding public education, undermining the federal law, and undermining the federal authority like the Department of Public Education. So there's a history. And when they said it, they began then talking about reform. Let me tell you, in North Carolina, right after the Brown decision, they came up with something called the Pearsall Plan Reform. I'm telling you all this so we understand that it's called the Pearsall Plan Reform. Here it was. They said, well, this is how we're going to comply with the Brown decision. Any parent, black or white, that does not want to send their child to an integrated public school can get some money from the state and can use that money to go to a private school. Now later on, they called it voucher. But in 1959, in the 1950s in North Carolina, it was called the Pearsall Plan. The goal was to derail and deform. And in the 1950s and 60s, all of these little private schools started forming in North Carolina as a way to undermine public education. The goal was to derail and deform. Then there was a cry to cut education, cut money. And remember where that came from. The extremists, Republican, whoever they were, became incensed when Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, declared that public education was a matter of national security. And Dwight Eisenhower put more money in public education than any other president before him, and said that it ought to be the course in America, that if we wanted a strong America, we had to invest as though it was a matter of national security. And Freddie Koch and the Birch Society and those that did not want to see desegregation work came after him. We got to remember this history so that we ask for, what do you really mean when you say reform? Then one last challenge is, we can't judge our success at the top. You're going to have public education. You can't just judge your success by how many kids, are passing the test or graduating. You got to ask the question, what about those that are not? You really want reform. If you really want reform, you will join the NAACP and people like Keith Ellison and others in fighting for a federal right to a public education. Don't you think it's strange? Don't you think it's strange that North Carolina has a constitutional right to public education, Milwaukee has a constitutional right to an adequate public education, but these United States of America still does not have a federal right to public education? Yeah. But then also, my friends, those of you in public education advocates, you can't isolate your fight. You can't be concerned about public education and not be concerned about other issues. You see, every time we deny living wages and leave whole communities impoverished, it costs us our soul. Every time we fail to provide health care on the front side of life, it costs us. And so you got to have a crowd. I don't care how, you can be in a great city, 2 cities, call them twin. And you can have great Fortune 500 companies and celebrate that as you should. You can have great philanthropy and celebrate that as you should. You can have one of the greatest hospitals and burn and trauma centers and celebrate that as you should. But you can't be so heavenly focused, you're no earthly good. You can't keep your eyes up here and not look down here. You can't just drive the interstates and go around impoverished communities. You got to get in your car and go through the hood. You got to go where people live. Yes. Yes, it's great that Milwaukee has 5 Fortune 500 companies and the best park system in the country and the home of the University of Minnesota and my team, the Minnesota Vikings, and that you got 7 hospitals, 4 ranked among America's best, and the world's 5th cleanest city according to Forbes. But you still have to answer this question eternally. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was a child trapped in the ghetto, did you care about me? Because you got to deal with the fact of the closures of schools, like Jordan Park and Davis Academy and Lincoln and North Star and Shingle Creek, and you cannot look just at the good and not deal with the 2,000 children identified as homeless every day in the Minneapolis public schools. And then go to church and say you love Jesus and don't forget that Jesus was homeless. I know you're great, Minneapolis. But your greatness is not going to just be determined by the top. The greatness is determined by how you reach those at the bottom. And you, no matter how good things are, no matter how great your test scores are, 33% of Minneapolis children live below the poverty line. And if you don't touch them, you have not finished your work. And I know you are a northern city, and I know y'all don't like to deal with racism and systemic racism up here, but 94% of those children in poverty are children of color. You gotta deal with it, baby. And not just black folk. All of us, we've got to deal with it. And it's not just about throwing some money at it. It's not just about individual charity. It's about analyzing the systems that have created these extremities in the first place, being willing to own them. You got to understand, you got to care about something more than just education. Every time we attempt to suppress the right to vote, it tears at the heart of our democracy and the necessary foundations to establish justice. And whenever you're in a climate like we're in now, where you have political extremists, now you can call them Tea Party, ultra-conservative, Coke money puppets, feeding the public with an immoral agenda, it must be challenged, because while you might have some victories, sometimes what you think is their loss is their step up. Let me show you what I mean. See, you say we beat voter ID that was pushed by the Tea Party, a solution in search of a problem. But go back and look. It's not like you beat them by 90%. It was a slim margin, which means what the margin was somewhere in the 40. It was what, 54? That means 40%. For them, that loss is not a loss. It is a stronghold. Because they build over time. You might have defeated something like the marriage amendment. But the reality is, look at the number of people that voted for it. That voted for people, regardless of how you feel about it personally and religiously. That's between you, your God, and your priest. But if you're an American, you cannot be against equal protection under the law. But right up here, in this enlightened northern area, you had a whole lot of folk that voted against people's equal protection under the law. And you got this agenda. And understand what they're doing, how they're framing this agenda. This is the Tea Party agenda, Lynn, in a nutshell. Sometimes you need to just break it down. Say, break it down. Yeah. You know, people try to be all cute. No, here's what they're saying. Here's what they're saying. The Tea Party folk, like your former Congressman Bachman and Boehner, and then get on down to your state Congress people, this is what they're feeding. And they're out there teaching it right now somewhere, having a forum. In essence, what they're saying, if you want a great America or a great Minnesota, this is how you get there. Deny public education and attack teachers and the unions that support them. Deny health care and Medicaid expansion, leave millions of people uninsured. Deny earned income tax credit, deny unemployment, deny labor rights, deny LGBT rights, deny women's rights, deny immigrants' rights, and hold vicious rallies against immigrant children. Cut more taxes for the wealthy and then declare you don't have any money for critical investments like education and infrastructure and health care. And when you know your agenda cannot survive if America really votes, then engage in the worst forms of voter suppression since Jim Crow. If you can't pass them in the North, pass them in the South, so you guarantee a blockade in the Congress that prevents even the North from getting many of the things that it needs. And then if you really want to have a great nation, tell every lie you can about the president, call him everything but an American, Suggest he's a thug in the White House, he's a criminal, he's too small for the office, and it suggests that there's something wrong with little black girls having pajama parties in the White House, refuse to pass anything he said just because you don't like him, even fight his wife when she wants children just to eat healthy vegetables. And then, if you really want a great America, after you have fanned all the flames and fires of racial and class and natural hatred, then here's the coup d'etat. Make sure that everyone can get a gun quicker than they can vote. And make sure every police department has armored personnel. That's their agenda. And you can't fight that agenda with just a left-right argument or a conservative versus liberal. We have to have a moral, because this is an immoral agenda. It's contrary to our deepest faith values. It's contrary to those values that says we're going to be judged by what we do to the least of these, not as individuals, but as nation. It's contrary to the values like in Isaiah 58 where the prophet says, if you want to please God, don't just have worship services, loose the bands of wickedness and stop exploitation in the workplace. It's contrary to our faith values that holds doctors and teachers and children in high regard. It's contrary to the call to heal the sick and care for the brokenhearted. It's contrary to the great prophetic scriptures of the Jewish tradition like Isaiah 10, which says, woe unto those who legislate evil and pass unjust laws that rob the poor of their right. It's contrary to the call, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a lot of stream. But it's not just contrary to our deepest moral values and religious values, is contrary to every promise in America. You say you want to reclaim the promise, first we got to know what that promise is. It's the promise that the government of the people and by the people shall never fade from the face of the earth. That's what we got to reclaim. It's the promise of equal protection under the law, regardless of your race, your creed, your sexuality, your class, your religion, or whoever you are. It's the promise. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's self-evident. Translation: if you don't understand everybody has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you just dumb. That's what self-evidence means. Self-evident means you don't have to go to school to get that. It's a part of who we are. The promise, we the people of the United States, in order to form the more perfect union, not to have freedom, because freedom is not the first principle of America. Freedom is the hope of America. But you can't get to freedom without going through the first principle of our Constitution, which is number one, the establishment of justice. Number two, the insurance of domestic tranquility. Number three, providing for the common good. And number four, promoting the general welfare, which means, by the way, why did we let welfare become a bad word if it's in the Constitution? And then, if you establish justice, if you ensure domestic tranquility, if you provide for the common defense, if you promote the general welfare, then you can pass and secure the blessings of liberty to yourself and to your children. Where there is no justice, there is no freedom. That's the promise. What is the promise? One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That's the promise. What is the promise? The promise is what Paul Wellstone said before he lifted from this earth. I dare to imagine a country where every child I hold in my hand are all God's children, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of whether they are boy or girl, regardless of their religion, regardless of rich or poor, that every child I hold in my hand will have the same chance to reach her potential or his full potential. That is the goodness of our country. That is the essence of the American dream. What is the promise? It's what Hubert Humphrey said. It was once said that the moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, the poor, and the handicapped. That is the promise. And anytime you have extremists, whether they win every election or not, but you have extremists that dare to attack these values and these promises, we are in a moral crisis. When you can run for office and get votes by actually saying to folk, elect me and I will do everything I can to undo the promise of America, we are in a moral crisis. Give me just a few minutes. But this crisis happens in America over and over. It's not something that's just happening now. In the 1800s, 1868, right after slavery, the end of slavery, in the South, blacks and whites came together. And in 4 years, they had transformed the South, and they were on their way to transform the nation. From 1868 to 1872, this is what their agenda. Number one, voting rights for everybody. 1868, 146 years ago. Number two, public education for every person, not just child. In the South, blacks and white, called fusion politics. Number three, fair wages and living wages in the 1860s. Number four, fair tax policy, increasing the taxes to ensure that they could come out of the devastation of slavery. And number five, fairness in the criminal justice system. And number four, fair representation in the juries and in the court. Where I came from, all over the South, these people, black and white, came together in 1868, and by 1870, by 1875, almost every legislature in the South, state legislature, was either controlled by African Americans or a fusion of blacks and whites coming together. We don't even talk about that history. But then extremists said, we can't have this. This is too much America. I mean, we didn't mean all that stuff we wrote, and if they meant it, we didn't mean it. And we sure didn't mean it for all these black people and white people to be working together. And so they came up with a movement called the Redemption Movement. And the Redemption Movement said that it had a philosophy. The Tea Party, I'm in the 1800s. Now I come to that. The Redemption Movement mantra was, let's take back America. 1872. The plan was formed, not as a violent organization, but as a political organization. And they set their hearts. And how did they do it? They began an immoral campaign of deconstruction. They used fear. They used political trickery. The first thing they attacked was the courts. They made sure the Supreme Court had ultra-extremists on it. Then they attacked the civil rights laws that were passed between 1868 and 1877. Then they attacked public education. Then they attacked tax policy, and they attacked voting rights. And then later on in the late 1800s, they had riots. And by 1900, the first Reconstruction was over. And we were in a moral crisis again. Then you have 1954, you get the Brown decision. And America resets her moral compass. The courts unanimously. One former Ku Klux Klan member was on that court that ruled unanimously. There was only one Supreme Court just in 1896 that dissented. In 1954, with the moral and legal arguments of Thurgood Marshall and Jewish and white and black lawyers, the court overturned. And in 1954, you start seeing the beginning of a new fusion movement. Blacks and white and Latinos come together. A fusion movement is born. Blacks and whites, civil rights and trade unions, young people. You get the March on Washington in '63, which was a march for jobs and justice. You get the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act of '65, Civil Rights Act of '64. You get a change in Social Security in 1954 that brought white women in. Yeah. Because in 1935, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed Social Security, he had to cut a deal with extremists in the South that they didn't want black people and poor brown people to have access to Social Security, so they made it so if you were in the agrarian culture or you were domestic, you couldn't pay in, but that knocked out 50% of white women. But in '54, that got changed. America was changing. America was resetting her moral compass. You get the war on poverty. You get community development banks. You get economic development. You get target economic development. You get changes. You get Medicare. You get Medicaid. And then again, the extremists. We can't have this. It's getting too close to this thing called a more perfect union. So what did they begin again? An immoral campaign of deconstruction. How did they do it? They said, well, let's come up, Kevin Phillips was his name, worked for Richard Nixon. He said, we got to come up with a strategy that can make white people vote against their own fears and make black people suspicious of all white people. So they came up with this white Southern strategy. Now he said, and Lee Atwater later on in 1981 confessed it on tape. Read, go listen to it on Google. He said, we found out in 1964, 65, 68, we couldn't use the N-word anymore. We couldn't use it in the South or in the North. We had to come up with another way. He said, so we learned code words. We learned code words to divide people, like school reform. Like, no, seriously, like tax cuts. This is the language, like forced busing, like states' rights. And he said, we stopped using the N-word and we started using, it's on Google. It's a whole interview. I don't know if he meant to say it, but he said it. And he said, and we figured out who was against who. And we used it to create fear and division. And we got, but we knew the policies, though they sounded benign, would have a deep deficit impact on African Americans, and would cause many whites in the suburbs of the North and in the South to see minorities as the problem. And we would once again, this is my word, relive what W.B. Du Bois talked about in the book Soul of Black People, is that the issue of being black in America sometimes is not being a people with problem, but when people make you a problem people. And the strategy worked. Yeah. And you included with that this law and order, this get tough on protesters. Richard Nixon goes into office. 1974, Charles Koch does a speech. It was in the New York Times recently. He said, look, let's don't invest in candidates anymore. Messiah candidate, let's invest in a movement. Let's build an infrastructure and mechanisms to feed our agenda 24/7 to the media, the think tanks and the public media. And what we will do is the politicians will automatically come out of that. We'll begin at the bottom. And an author of that article said that progressives in that moment chose to walk away from movement, walk away from our moral that had brought us a mighty long way. And it wasn't just walking away. All the leaders who led Marley were killed. So people were in kind of a social depression. And we chose to look for a Messiah candidate. But as soon as the candidates were over, the infrastructure was gone, the mechanism was gone. But the extremists worked on building a movement. And they took our playbook, they built from the bottom, they changed the moral category. That no longer was poverty a moral category, and public education a moral category, labor unions a moral category, and economic justice a moral category. Now moral categories would only be prayer in school, abortion, and homosexuality. And we, in some ways, allowed and gave up that moral stance, and they took it. And so the article goes on to say, it's not that extremism is so strong, but that those who know we need a progressive moral agenda are so unorganized. And we overestimate their power and underestimate our own. Wow. And Ronald Reagan in 1980 used this new language, went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, had one of his major campaign stops, used every code word of the white Southern strategy, never sounded like a racist, never sounded like he was for discrimination. In fact, he sounded like there was a dawn of America coming, using the code language, set people against one another, and won by a landslide, and got people in the South to vote for him and all over this country. And his policies would hurt the very working people that voted for him. So, as I close, the reality is, we better be vigilant. And while you've had a lot of victories here, you cannot rest on your laurels, because there are some forces that are still wanting to tinker with the soul of our democracy. We have to unpack the greatest myth of our time, and that is that extremist politics that attack children and attack the sick and attack minorities don't just hurt a small group of people. It can't be isolated. It's a kind of disease in the democracy. That if you don't deal with the issues of the poor, the nation will implode.
economically and otherwise. Otto Schwammer said at MIT, we commit attention violence against the poor, and the problem with our economic theory is the blind spot of consciousness, and we seem not to understand that if you allow the bottom to exist without dealing with it, no matter how stable the top is, it will eventually implode. So I came to Minneapolis to say, y'all have done some great things, and in some ways we were so glad when you pushed back Vote ID and on the marriage amendment, and we're so glad of some of the successes, but you've got work to do, and we need you to stay vigilant. Because let me tell you what it will be like if you don't stay vigilant. I'm here to tell you that down in North Carolina, we've seen greedy, wealthy extremists play on the fears of working class white people and others, and they pushed an immoral agenda. And we've seen ultra-conservative, extreme conservative politicians and their 5 natural backers adopt the divide and conquer strategy. Now, they didn't run on what they were going to do. They ran on prayer in the school. They ran on wanting to have the vote and have integrity. They ran on an anti-Obama campaign, calling him a socialist. They ran on, we're going to stop people from marrying the same sex. Voted for that foolishness. And then when they got in office, Tom Tillis, who now wants to be a United States Senator, and the governor, who some have suggested might have national potential for president, that's why I'm telling you, they ran, this is what they did in the first 50 days. First 50 days, they cut Medicaid and denied 500,000 people access to Medicaid without any doctors being allowed to do that. When they got the power, they denied 170,000 people unemployment. When they got the power, they cut 900,000 people's earned income tax credit to give 23 of the wealthiest families a tax cut. Yeah. They cut $1 billion from public education and drove us to 49th in the nation in per pupil spending. They went after LGBT rights. They strengthened the anti-labor laws in North Carolina. And on Maundy Thursday, during Holy Week of 2013, they began the process of passing the worst voter suppression bill we've seen since Jim Crow. They did not run on that. And they tested it for years by having little pushes on marriage amendment and little to get a foothold. And then people kind of missed it. Then they changed the redistricting lines. And so that even though 130,000 people voted for progressives in 2012, we lost because of this redistricting. They packed and stacked 57% of black voters into 27 out of 120 House districts. 51%. And 49% of black voters into 19 out of 50 Senate districts. I'm telling you, you better listen to what these folks are saying and get underneath. It's not just about prayer in school and voter ID and same-sex marriage. It is about this extremism that wants to find a way in the public arena to grab power, and they will get people to vote for them any way they can. And once they get the power, they will even pass policies that hurt the very people that voted for them. We've seen it. I come here to announce that you can have some great things, like North Carolina, one of the greatest university systems, the Research Triangle Paul. We've got more historically African-American college than any other state. We've been seen kind of as a progressive state, but I'm telling you, these forces of ALEC and the Tea Party are vigilant. And I want you to know, we didn't start organizing with the Ford Together on Monday last year when they came in office. We started 8 years ago when Democrats were in office, because you better build even now. You got to fight and have a strategy even now. You must challenge even your friends, then you will be more able to challenge your enemies. So what have we seen? We've seen the power of building what we call an indigenous-led state government focused, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, transformative fusion movement. We decided that we needed to come together. We looked at state government, we looked at the legislature, we asked environmentalists. We said, who's voting against you? The education, who's voting against you? The healthcare, who's voting against you? The poverty areas, who's voting against you? And we found out they were the same people. And so the question we said, and who's voting against voting rights? The same people. Well, if they are foolish enough to be together, why aren't we smart enough to come together? That was the issue. That's the issue. And we started last year, and we decided that there are some agendas that we don't need another meeting to decide about an agenda. so tired of advocates. Every time we want to have a meeting, the first thing is, what is the agenda? Somebody ought to know by now. We don't need an agenda. We need some action. We need some unity. We need some fight. We need some standing. You didn't have to have an agenda to eat tonight. You just came in and it ain't what was set before you. So let me sit something before you. And if y'all need to vote on this agenda, then it just ain't no hope. You have 5 things you have to be able to agree on. You are everybody, regardless of whether you're a teacher or an environmentalist or a healthcare advocate or the NAACP. Number 1, you have to be able to agree that we should all be fighting for pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that create economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, community development banks, strong safety net services for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, and fair tax reform. I don't think we need that. We need some action. Number 2, this is regardless of who's in power. See, a moral agenda doesn't worry about who's in power. A moral agenda stands up and challenges who's ever in power. Number 2, you are educational equality by ensuring every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, as well as access to community colleges, universities, and by securing equitable funding for minority colleges and universities and full funding of public education. We ought to agree on that. Number 3. Healthcare for all, by assuring access to the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and providing environmental protection for every community. Number 4, fairness in the criminal justice system by addressing the continuing inequalities in the system and providing equal protection under the law for black, brown, and poor white people. Number 5, protecting and expanding voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights, and the fundamental principle of equal protection under law. I want to suggest we don't need another meeting and when we put up those blue, yellow, green, and red dots every year to decide what the agenda is. We ought to know this is the agenda. There is a vision. The people don't have to perish. The problem is the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. We need folk to come together around the promises of America and get out of the meeting rooms and get out of hotels and get in the legislative halls, get in the voting booths, and get in the street. That's what we need. And when you stop playing around with it, and you have not just, you can't just be a hellraiser, you got to be a heavy lifter. Oh, yeah. You can't just be cursed to darkness, you got to have an agenda of hope. Right. And I'm here to tell you as I close, what happens when you do it? And if it can happen down south, baby, it can happen anywhere. Oh, yeah. With this agenda, we've now been at the Moral Monday movement the 69 straight weeks. Wow. We've had 120 actions. If you count the 7 years before it, we've been at this 8 years. Young people are engaged like never before. They're all over the state now, 47 of them registering 50,000 voters in 10 weeks. We've got people from the mountains to the coast. We've had 1,004 people of all different colors, races, and political parties arrested standing against this extremism. Over 1,000 clergy with this agenda have now come in, Jewish and Muslim and Christian and Baha'i and Buddhists and others. We got labor unions and civil rights and women and LGBT and the immigrant working together like never before. People have come up out of the depression, there's nothing we can do, and they have hope. We've made a state movement a national issue. We've inspired similar movements in at least 9 other states and growing. In a few weeks, we're going to have 7 straight days of moral action, and almost every state in the South is going to be doing it at the same time, which has not happened since the 60s. When we started in, the governor was at 50% in the poll. After 67 weeks, he's now at 30% and falling because he's committed to this. When we started, this extreme same legislator said, we got a super majority, we don't have to listen to you. But now, after 67 straight weeks, the legislature that was at 40% is now under 18% in the polls and polls. When we started, most of the issues we stand for were underwater, under 50%. But now, 55% of North Carolinians believe we ought to give long-term unemployment to people who lost their job for no fault of their own. 55% of North Carolinians now believe we ought to deal with a living wage and a minimum wage. 58% of North Carolinians now believe we ought to expand Medicaid. 61% of North Carolinians now are opposed to using public funds for vouchers to support the private schools. Sometimes you may not be able to change the politician, but you can change the climate in which the politicians have to exist. We've seen hundreds come together. We've seen people stand together. In fact, when you use this moral narrative, that some things are constitutionally inconsistent, morally indefensible, historically inaccurate, and economically insane. And you don't just separate by left and right, but you talk about let's come together in the deepest values of our humanity. You start seeing some miracles. I'm telling you, miracles start happening. And when you build a platform not for the politician, but for the everyday person. And when you put a face on the pain and people can see it, you can then shift the center of political gravity. So much so that last summer I got a call in the middle of tomorrow Monday and it said, come to Mitchell County. And when they said come to Mitchell County, y'all were laughing, my answer was this: hell no. Let me tell you why. Let me tell you why. So y'all don't think I'm just a cussing preacher. And if y'all do pray for me, and while you doing that, pray for yourself, because some of y'all be cussing too. But anyway, Mitchell County is 99% white, 89% Republican. In 1920, all the black folk were run out of Mitchell County because of an alleged sexual incident with a black man. Run out. I used to be human relations director. I know where the hate groups are. I know where all of that is in the South. I ain't going up there. Then one of the white ministers that's about 80 years old, he said, Barber, when you have a moral movement, you can't just preach to the choir. You got to believe that people can recover their humanity. You can't automatically believe that people are not with you. So he's a good friend of mine. He convinced me. That morning I kissed my wife. I'm talking about I kissed her. Now, y'all got kind of strange quiet. Ain't none of y'all never had no kids. Y'all got real quiet. And don't be mad at me because I had one. Get your own. But anyway, I kissed her real good. I ain't so sure she won't see me no more. I preached that morning. Y'all know how a black preacher preach when he think he might be his last time? Then I got in my car and I went up. I took y'all with me and her sister. I said, if they can sing, I can run out the back. You know, I took my security with me here, you know, the gun that he got, it's rusty, it's one look, it'll give you gangrene, probably won't kill you, but you know. And we went up that mountain. One road in, one road out. When I got there, they said, met me, 300 people, wasn't but one black guy in there, he was a mulatto. Seriously. And they said, Reverend, we didn't come here to talk politics because we're Republican. We came here to talk about this agenda. We want to hear about this agenda. Will you sing the song, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds Our Heart? I said, sure. They said, do you know the scripture in the Bible about Jesus overturning the money table? I said, yeah, that was the first moral Monday. It happened on Monday of Holy Week. And then they turned it over to me. And for an hour, kind of long with like I'm doing tonight, I walked them through the history. I talked to them about public education. I gave them the numbers of how many people in those mountains had lost their access to earned income tax credit. I talked to them about how these companies were able to leave them in the mountains and move away because there were no union rights. Talked about them the number of unemployed people, not black, unemployed people that were denied unemployment, and how by cutting public education it was going to destroy opportunity for their children and their children's children and the teachers that were giving their lives up there in that mountain. And after about an hour, they said, Reverend Barber, let me tell you why we asked you to come up here. We've been secretly coming tomorrow Monday. I said, what? They said, yeah, in fact, every Sunday we have pre-moral Monday at the parking lot. And we come down there because we had to make sure that you weren't just an arm of the Democratic Party, that you were serious about a moral agenda. And she said, because up in here in these mountains, we believe you don't kick folk when they're down.
We're Republicans, but we're Lincoln Republicans. We're Eisenhower, we're Teddy Roosevelt Republicans, like Teddy Roosevelt, who believed in the 4 moral things of government: minimum and living wages, health care, environmental protection, public education. He believed that was the centerpiece. And they said, so we came down there to let you know we're with you. And we want you to know, first of all, right over there, that's the former chair of the Republican Party. He's just resigned and denounced it because he's not an extremist. And he's sick and tired of the Tea Party extremists, and he's particularly tired of how they've attacked public education. I said, my God. And then they said, if you need any public school teachers that are Republican to come speak at tomorrow Monday, we got something to send down there. I said, what? And so they sent one lady down there, and she said something I couldn't say. If I'd have said it, it'd have been all over the news. She said, Governor, I'm a Republican 9 generations, and your policies are just stupid. I said, that's pretty good, you know. Then they said at 9 o'clock at night, you know, like the night, and they said, Reverend Barber, can we start a branch of the NAACP? I said, what? I said, now wait a minute, this is starting to sound like Pentecost here. I said, we never even dreamed of having a branch of the NAACP in Mitchell County. It was kind of off limit. They said, well, you're gonna have one now. It's gonna be predominantly white, but we're gonna be one of the fightingest groups you ever seen in the whole South. And I'm here to tell you, inside of 6 months, they had 160 members, and they ain't missed a meeting yet. And they're radical. And so that night, about 9:30, they said, Reverend Barber, we want you to do one more thing. I said, y'all, I got to go to Asheville. We having a march tomorrow. They said, we're going to be there. We're going to have, in fact, 10,000 people showed up the next day in Asheville, 3% black, NAACP banner in the front, and 10,000 people showed up, 90% of which were white. And they said, no, you can't leave that. They said, we want to march. I said, wait, hold it. I said, what march where? They said, we want to march tonight on the Tea Party representative's house. I said, tonight? They said, tonight. I said, wait a minute, white people. I said, now y'all just got in, and you got to learn the rules. Negroes don't march at night. No, we normally march in the daytime. Y'all started that business about the marching at night. Now, if you call a march during the day, then I'll march right to his house and where everybody can see it. But I'm not marching at that man's house at night for him to shoot me, because he ain't gonna shoot you. And they fell out laughing, but the next day they met us. And now they're marching to the polls, and we got organized. And this past week, we went back to Asheville and had 7,000 people, and the president of the Mitchell County branch of the NAACP, a white lady that kind of looks like Lynn, introduced me, and this is what she said: there's not a lot of difference between civil rights activism and mountain populism, and I'm here to tell you, up in these hills and these mountains, the one thing you don't do is poke the bear. And Reverend Barber, these folk, when they cut education, they poke the bear, and we're here to stand up with you together. So my friends, we need this moral construct, state movements that use moral language to reconfigure the discussion and the debate. It's not about left and right. It's not about liberal versus conservative. It's about what's right and wrong. That's the only way we can take this country to higher ground. We have seen in North Carolina the power of mobilizing in the street, the power of mobilizing at the poll, the power of challenging even when you're in the minority, the power of taking things to court, and the power of calling people to higher ground. And the moral cry of people's heart is there something higher than the normal division? And my son, who is an environmental physics, he tells me, he says, Daddy, if you ever find yourself lost or lost in the mountains, he says, Daddy, don't walk out through the bottom, the valley. And I said, why, Dad, son? He said, because snakes live down low. They live in the valley. He said, and biologists will tell you, in every mountainous territory, there's something called a snake line. And if you want to make it out safely, it might not make sense, but you go up before you go over. Y'all don't hear what I'm saying? He said you go up above the snake line. And snakes can't live at higher ground because they're cold-blooded animals and they asphyxiate if you take them too high. Well, we gotta start understanding that when you spend lewd amounts of money to take over the court system, that's below the snake line. When you attack public education and teachers, that's below the snake line. When you refuse to lift up poor communities, that's below the snake line. When you refuse to deal with the issues of racism, that's below the snake line. When you reinstitute resegregation, that's below the snake line. So we've got to mobilize together. We've got to fight together. We've got to stand together from Minnesota to North Carolina to take America above the snake line. Higher ground where every child is educated. Higher ground where the sick are healed. Higher ground where we are one people, one God, one nation, indivisible. Higher ground where our voting rights are secure. Higher ground where we love everybody. We've got to believe our politics can be moral. Our politics can be kind. Our politics can be just. Our politics can be fair. Our politics can be equal. Somebody ought to say, we refuse to live low down. We're on our way to higher ground. And if I could be a preacher for 2 seconds, when I'm up there in the stratosphere and the Spirit takes me to higher ground, it's there that I'm reminded the moral arc of the universe might be long, but it bends toward justice. When I'm up there in the stratosphere, I'm reminded if God be for you, it doesn't matter who's against you. When I'm up there in the stratosphere, I'm reminded weeping may endure for a night, Tea Party may endure for a night, Koch brothers may endure for a night, but if you hang in there, joy still comes in the morning. When I'm up there in the higher place, I'm reminded they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up on wings as eagles. They shall run and not get weary. They shall walk and not faint. So I don't know about you, but I'm pressing on. The upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Plant Minnesota on higher ground. Plant North Carolina on higher ground. Plant AFT on higher ground. Plant America on higher ground. Lord, lift us up and plant our feet on higher ground.